Hello, Preet, can you hear me? Just give me a second. I'm opening my notes and then get started. So today we'll continue from where we left in the last class. Okay, just a second. Okay. Hmm. Okay, so in the last class, Preet, let me give you a quick update of what we discussed. We talked about multiplier. In today's class, we'll talk about the multiplier effect. In yesterday's class, we talked about consumption function, saving function, and we also talked about investment function, government spending function, and all that, right? So where is this all of this coming from, right? So what we are doing in this macroeconomics unit is Keynesian Cross. And what did we say? Keynesian Cross is basically a model used to predict the GDP of a country, right? So how much will be the country's total value of goods and services produced? That is its GDP. Now, to predict GDP of a country, we use this model, which is known as Keynesian Cross. Okay. Now, in this, we said that we will look at this, but after we have covered a couple of different smaller topics, which is the first one that we talked about was circular flow of income. Now, if you remember, circular flow of income is a diagram that shows how money circulates in an economy. Circular flow of income, right? So in that, we talked about that there are four sectors in an economy: household, firms, government, and international trade, right? So there are four sectors in an economy. Households are, individuals like people who are consumers, right? Households provide the factors of production to firms, right? Then firms use these factors of production to produce goods and services, which households obviously buy, right? Because they're producing for the households, which are consumers. So firms produce goods and services, households consume those goods and services. Then what's the role of the government? So government is there as a regulatory body. Government makes sure that everything is operating smoothly and there is no disruption and things like that. And then the fourth and the last sector in an economy is international trade, right? So international trade is when a country is exporting or importing something, right? So this was the model that we discussed, which is known as circular flow of income, international trade. Okay. Now, after knowing this, we started our discussion about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, right? So we said aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods and services produced in an economy at different general price level. At different general price level, what will be the total demand for goods and services? That is basically the aggregate demand. Okay. Now, this being said, we said that what is aggregate demand made up of? Aggregate demand is made up of five components. What are the five components? Consumption, right? So aggregate demand is made up of consumption, investment, government spending, plus exports minus imports. Okay. Then we said that we will discuss the function. We will talk about the function of each of these components, right? So what do we mean when we say function? So consumption function is basically a mathematical equation that shows what is consumption of a country or of an individual is made up of. Similarly, we said that we'll talk about investment function and look at the components on which the investment of an economy depends upon. Similarly, we'll talk about the government spending, we'll talk about the exports, we'll talk about the imports and all that things, right? Okay, now then talking about consumption function, we said that total consumption is basically made up of autonomous consumption, which is I naught, plus marginal propensity to consume, right? Marginal propensity to consume times Y. Y is the national income, which is basically the GDP, right? Right. If you're looking at one individual, then it would be one individual's income. But since we're talking about macroeconomics, so Y in economics is used to denote to GDP, the total value of goods and services produced in a country, right? And what is MPC? We did discuss this. So marginal propensity to consume is basically change in consumption due to change in income. So how much will be increase in an individual's consumption due to increase in his income? That would be your marginal propensity to consume, right? Okay. And then what is C naught? So C naught, we said, is autonomous consumption. What is autonomous? Autonomous is anything that is not dependent on income, right? So that is dependent on other factors, but is not dependent on income, right? So it's dependent on factors like, expectations about the future or the income tax rates and things like that, right? Now we did look at the graph for consumption function, and we said that it will be an upward sloping graph. It will be an upward sloping graph like this, right? And it will have a y-intercept. It will have a y-intercept, right? Now, what do we have on the y-axis? Obviously, we have the consumption on the y-axis, and we have income on the. So you have consumption on the y-axis. You have consumption on the y-axis, and you have income on the income or the GDP of a country on the x-axis, right? Again, right? It's the income or the GDP on the x-axis. Okay. Now this upward sloping graph shows us what? It shows that higher the income or higher the GDP in a country, right? So if you're talking about a country, it would be for a whole country, which is basically its GDP. If you're talking about an individual, then it would only be the income of an individual, right? So if the person's income is increasing, right? So if you move from A to B, right? What it shows us is that higher income leads to higher consumption levels. So this will be your consumption if this much is your income. And similarly, if your incomes increase from this point A to this point B, right? If your incomes increase from this point A to an income level higher than this, which say, let's say Y0, Y2, right? So higher income levels will result in higher consumption, right? So consumption has direct relationship with income. Higher the income, higher the consumption, right? Okay. Then we talked about, just to give you a quick overview of, that this is the equation of consumption function, which is C equals C naught plus MPC times Y. Okay. Now, if the gradient of the line, which is MPC, so if marginal propensity to consume is increasing, then the line becomes more steep, right? So it will still start from the same point on the y-axis, but the line will become more steep if the marginal propensity to consume is increasing. Because what it actually shows that now people will spend a bigger proportion of their incomes. Higher MPC means that people will spend bigger proportion of their incomes, right? Got it? Okay. Now, on the other hand, obviously, if marginal propensity to consume is decreasing, the line will become less steep. So the line will become less steep if marginal propensity to consume is decreasing, right? So that's the first thing that you need to know. Then one more thing that you need to know, that what happens if your autonomous consumption is increasing. So with higher autonomous consumption, your entire consumption function, with higher autonomous consumption, your entire consumption function will shift to a higher level. So you can see for yourself that it has shifted upwards. Similarly, on the other hand, with a decrease in autonomous consumption, your entire consumption function will shift downwards parallel. Right. Okay, so you can put it like this. Exactly, right? So absolutely correct, Preet. So if autonomous consumption is increasing, so you're saying that this means that the necessities have increased. Yeah. So basically people have started spending more, regardless of their income, they have started spending more. That is what it means, right? Regardless of their income, they have started spending more. So that's why your entire budget line, that's why your entire consumption function has shifted upwards, and vice versa. When your consumption function shift downwards, that means that your autonomous consumption has reduced, which means that overall spending, regardless of, regardless not the induced consumption, your autonomous consumption has reduced if it shift downwards, and if it shift upwards, it means your autonomous consumption has increased. Got it? Okay. Now we also talked about the saving function. So what's the shape of the saving function? Have a look at this. So saving function, again, is a mathematical equation that shows how much amount would someone save. So on the y-axis, you have the savings, So on the positive side of the y-axis, it's positive, like you are saving something. And on the negative side of the y-axis, it's this saving. On the negative side of the y-axis, it's this savings, right? So it's negative. You can also call it this savings. And what do we have on the x-axis? Again, just like the consumption function, on the saving function, we have income on the x-axis. Okay, now think about this. The shape of your consumption function, the shape of your saving function is upward sloping, right? But it has a negative y-intercept. So what does it mean to have a negative y-intercept? Basically, think about this. The saving of an individual is equals to negative S naught, which is autonomous dis savings, plus MPS, which is marginal propensity to save, times Y, right? Now think about this. What is this autonomous dis savings? Now I did tell you that when someone is not working, right? So think about this. When someone's income is zero, right? How would that person finance his this autonomous consumption? So to finance your autonomous consumption, you have to use money from your savings. That's why it comes with the negative sign, right? That's why your savings, autonomous dis savings, right? So it's dis saving, it's in the negative part of the y-axis, right? So when your income levels are zero, how you are sponsoring yourself, how are you buying yourself basic necessities? By dis saving the money that you have saved previously, right? Then slowly and gradually, as your income increase, as the income levels increase, what happens? You start moving from the negative part of the y-axis, which was dis saving, to the positive part of the y-axis, which is savings, right? So more the income, more the savings, and this is how it goes. Got it? Preet? Is there any confusion, anything that's not clear so far? Anything that you want to ask me, right? Now, this being said, we will, perfect, right? Then towards the end of the class, we did something which we could not complete, and that we will do today, right? Now, aggregate demand, we already know, is made up of these 5 components, right? So the total demand in an economy, for all goods and services is basically equal to this thing, right? So the total demand for all goods and services in an economy is equals to this. What it basically means, C is the total consumption. We did write down the definitions of each of these components. Consumption is the money that consumers are spending on buying themselves the basic things, the goods and services that they need for their survival. Investment is the money that for companies are spending on buying capital goods. Government spending is the money that the government is spending on, public transport, healthcare, education, and so on. Exports are the products that are produced in your country, but those are bought by foreign consumers. And imports are the products that are produced in other parts of the world, but are consumed by your people. Okay. Now, what we need to do here is that we will substitute each of these components with their functions. We will substitute. Why are we doing this, Preet? We'll get to see in a bit when we look at the final graph for Keynesian Cross. So now after this, when we're about to look at the final graph for the Kensing Cross, then you will understand that why was this thing that we're about to do was important, right? So Kensing Cross, do remember, is a model. It's a graph that predicts the GDP of a country, right? But before we come to this thing, we just need to do this final stage, and that is to substitute each of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 components with their functions, right? So then that means that your aggregate demand would be equal to, so instead of C, what will I write? Consumption functions. What is consumption functions? C naught plus MPC, C naught plus MPC times Y, right? So that is your consumption function, right? Then in this, we will add investment function. Now, what is investment function? Think about this. In the last class, I told you that we will assume, even though that is not very realistic assumption, but we will assume that the investment in an economy is only autonomous investment. It's only autonomous investment, which means that it's not dependent on the income levels. It's not dependent on the GDP, but it's a fixed amount. It's some fixed amount, I naught. So investment in the economy is just a fixed amount, which is equals to I naught. Then the government spending, similarly, the government spending in an economy is just equal to, it's just equal to G naught. The exports in an economy are just equal to X naught, right? And similarly, the imports in an economy are just equal to M naught. Now, what are M naughts? All of these naught components are your autonomous components, which means that they're not dependent on the country's GDP levels. These are fixed amounts which are regardless of how much is the country's GDP. So we are assuming that investment in a country is not dependent on the country's GDP levels, but it is dependent on things like, let's say, what are generally some of the factors that affect investment of a country? How much stable is a country, right? So India and China recently have had a lot of investment because of the fact that they had very stable, political environment, and secondly, they were very business friendly environments where they were giving the country was giving preference and preferential treatment to investors by giving them tax holidays, not charging them taxes or charging them low taxes, and making it easier to do business in those countries, right? So any factor would affect investment, but not the GDP. So do remember the main difference that we have always talked about, that there would be an autonomous component and there would be an induced component. So autonomous component, think about this, autonomous is component that does not depend on the income slash GDP, right? Whereas induced consumption or induced component is the one that depends on the income slash GDP levels, right? Is it simple? Right? Okay. Now for all the other components of aggregate demand, investment, government spending, exports and imports, we will assume that these are all only autonomous components, not induced, right? Okay. Now this being said, what we will do is that we will simply replace I with I naught. We will replace G with G naught. We will replace X with X naught. And we will replace M comes with the negative, right? M with M naught, right? So this gives us the final form, right? This gives us the final form. Now we will rearrange this a little bit, right? So just give me a second and let me get rid of this, right? So we will rearrange this equation and we will bring all the naught components on the left-hand side. So it will be C naught plus I naught, C naught plus I naught plus G naught plus X naught minus M naught. So all of these naught components come on the left-hand side plus MPC, which is the marginal propensity to consume, times Y, this on the other side, right? Now, this has brought us to the final form that we will use in the Keynesian Cross. Now, this is the final form that we're about to use in our Keynesian Cross. Okay, now think about this. Let's look at the graph for the Keynesian Cross, right? Now, why was this important? What will this show us? As we already know, it will show us the GDP of a country, right? How will it show us the GDP? That is what we're about to look at, right? Okay, just a second. Okay, right? So this is Keynesian Cross. Now, what do we have on the y-axis, right? This is aggregate expenditure. Now, this might sound a little confusing, right? Now, from all of a sudden, from using the word aggregate demand to this word aggregate expenditure, what's this thing, right? I'll tell you, just give me a second, don't worry about it. What is aggregate expenditure? So we have aggregate expenditure, which is also written as AE. So we have AE on the y-axis and we have GDP on the GDP of a country is on the x-axis, right? Now, what is this? That is what I'm about to explain you, right? Okay. You can write this as GDP, and in bracket you can also use Y, because Y is used to denote to GDP. Okay, now what is aggregate expenditure? Let's come back to the notes and let me tell you the difference between aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure, right? Difference between expenditure. Okay, now think about this. Okay, now aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure has no difference except for the fact that aggregate demand is based on different levels of price, different price levels, spending economy, right? Based on different price levels. Whereas aggregate expenditure is the total spending in an economy based on different levels of income slash or different levels of GDP, right? Now think about this. The only difference between aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure is the components are the same. Everything is the same. So aggregate demand is also equals to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And aggregate expenditure is also equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. But the difference is that aggregate demand is affected by the general price level. So when we make the aggregate demand, so if I have to quickly show you, if you remember in the AS, when we used to make the aggregate demand, we used to have general price level on the y-axis. You remember? We used to have GPL, which is general price level on the y-axis. Now, what is the general price level? General price level shows the average price level, average prices in an economy. And that is basically an indicator of inflation. So that is an indicator of inflation. So when inflation is higher in the country, its GPL level will be higher, right? And when inflation is lower, the general price level will be lower. And the way we used to make the aggregate demand curve, it used to be simple downward sloping demand curve, right? Like this, which basically shows that if general price level is higher, think about this, what will happen to your aggregate demand? When your general price level is higher, obviously at higher prices, people will spend less because their purchasing power is less, right? What happens when inflation takes place in an economy, right? Consumers' spending power decreases. Their affordability is decreased. So therefore, at higher general price level, your aggregate demand is less, and vice versa, at lower general price level, your aggregate demand is higher, right? That is the graph for aggregate demand. Now for the aggregate expenditure, right, exactly, right? Now for the aggregate expenditure, let me show, make that one also on the same, right? So that you can then compare. Now, aggregate expenditure is not showing you the relationship between price level and demand. It's showing you the relationship between demand and income. So due to change in income, how much will be the change in demand? Now, before I even make the graph, Preet, can you predict whether the relationship will be positive or negative? Do you expect the income and total spending to have a positive, like direct relationship, or do you expect the relationship to be negative and worse? You do expect it to be positive. Excellent, right? Yes, that is correct, that it will be a direct relationship because we know that higher incomes, higher GDP levels, or higher income in an economy would result in higher demand. Why? Because people have more purchasing power. So exactly opposite to what happens in the case of price level. Here the relationship would be direct because more incomes mean more affordability, and therefore your aggregate expenditure would be higher if your income levels are higher, right? Simply speaking. Okay, now this being said, we'll move on and we will continue with our graph for Kensing Cross, right? So this was y1, this will be y2, right? Now, think about this. Let's go back and look at the graph for Keynesian Cross. Now, Keynesian Cross, as I said, is a graph that predicts the GDP of a country, right? So on the y-axis, you simply have aggregate expenditure, and on the x-axis, you have the GDP of a country or total income of a country or GDP, whatever you want to call it, right? Okay, now think about this. Now, how will we make the graph, right? Now, let me bring the equation that we have just, made, right? Now, think about this. Quick recap one more time, right? So aggregate expenditure is made up of these 5 components, this, right? So this is your aggregate demand, right? So this is your aggregate demand, sorry, which is made up of these 5 components. And I did tell you that aggregate expenditure is also the same. It's also the same. The components are the same, right? So all I can do is just substitute the word AD here with AE. I can substitute the word aggregate demand with the word aggregate expenditure, right? So on the left-hand side, then I'll write aggregate expenditure, right? Okay. Now have a look at this. Have a look at this, right? Now it will be an upward sloping graph, Preet, and it will start with the y-intercept. It will be an upward sloping graph and it will start with the y-intercept. Why? Because there are some not components. Let me write this down, right? So this is aggregate expenditure, right? So all the not components, these 5 components, will be the y-intercept. So this is the y-intercept, right? So y-intercept is equals to, let me write this down, C naught plus I naught, C naught plus I naught plus G naught plus X naught minus M naught. So these are all the not components. And then this gradient of the line is basically MPC, marginal propensity to consume, right? So all the not components come. So the not components are making your y-intercept, right? And the gradient is basically made up of the marginal propensity to consume. Is making sense, Preet? Because what this graph actually shows us is the same thing that we just discussed, right? That higher the GDP of a country, higher will be the total spending in the economy. And this is very intuitive and, obvious that if people think about it, if in Pakistan or if in India, people are having higher incomes, right? They're earning more from the work that they do, either in their businesses or by working in, in any job or stuff like that, right? Then with higher incomes, their affordability would be more. They will have more affordability and therefore their spending will be higher. The spending in the economy will be higher if income levels of a country are higher. Is this clear, Preet? Is this making sense? Okay, now we are moving towards the very final stage of this model, right? So this is what aggregate expenditure looks like, right? So, okay. Now another graph that we are about to add on this, another curve that we are about to add to this graph is basically a line, x is equals to y line. And that is very important. I explain you why we are making that, right? Now I'm about to make another line, another curve, and it starts from the y-axis. Sorry, it starts from the origin, right? So this line, green line that I've made is starting from the origin, and I will label it as x equals y. Now, what is this x equals to y line? This other line was aggregate expenditure. Let me also write this down. So this is AE, aggregate expenditure. And I have made another curve on the graph, which is x is equals to y line, and it's starting from the origin. Okay. Now let's try to understand why I have made this and what it represents, right? Now, Preet, aggregate expenditure shows that at a certain income level, how much would be the total demand for goods and services, right? You have to listen to this carefully. Aggregate expenditure shows you what would be the total demand for goods and services at different levels, at different income levels. The total demand for goods and services at different income levels. Does it make sense? Now, if I choose any random point on this AE graph at different income levels. So if I choose any random point on this AE graph, let's say I choose this point C, right? Now this point C shows me that at this income level, right? At this income level of, let's say Y1, Y2, whatever it is, right? How much will be the total demand for goods and services, right? That is what it shows, because what is aggregate expenditure? The total demand for goods and services in an economy, right? Okay, but another thing that you need to know, that how much is the supply, how much is the production, right? So having the demand for goods and services is one thing, and how much production or how much quantity of goods and services are available to be sold in the market, that's another thing. Now, if you pay close attention, aggregate expenditure, this y-axis shows you the demand, that how much would be the demand for goods and services, and what is the actual production in that country at a certain point in time. What is the actual production for goods and services at a certain point in time? That is shown through your GDP. So this is your production, or this is your supply, which shows that how much quantity of goods and services are actually being produced in that country. I repeat, this is the most important point in the Keynesian Cross. So getting this right is very important, right? So let me explain this again, and that will help you better understand. Think about this, right? Now, the idea is that technically what happens in any market. Let's first talk about the market. In the market, we know that it is the normal simple supply and demand for a product that determines the equilibrium. So where the demand and supply of a good are equal, that is the equilibrium point. Why? Because that shows how much quantity is being produced, right? So supply is showing you the quantity that is produced, demand is showing you the quantity that is demanded. So when production is equals to demand, or supply is equals to demand, simply speaking, right? That will be the equilibrium point, right? That is where the equilibrium is, right? So there could be only one equilibrium at a time, and this is the point where the equilibrium is, because only at this quantity, the two things are equal. At this quantity Q1, the demand is also Q1 and the supply is also Q1. That's why it's the equilibrium point, right? If I choose any other point, right, or any other price level, that will not be equilibrium. Why? Because either the demand will be more or the supply will be more, right? So it's not an equilibrium. This is what happens in one market. This is what happens in one market. This is microeconomics. When we talk about macroeconomics, we are not looking at one product and one service. We are looking at all the products and all the goods and services at the same time. Now think about this. How much is the demand for all goods and services in an economy, right? That is shown through your aggregate expenditure, right? What is aggregate expenditure? The total demand for goods and services at different income levels. So this is showing you the aggregate demand. In fact, we did talk about this. Not how about we not use the word demand only, because it's not the demand for one product, it's aggregate demand, which is the total demand for all goods and services, right? So this is what this is showing us, right? So it's the aggregate demand, this aggregate expenditure. And what is the total supply or total production or aggregate supply, as we say, that is basically shown by the actual GDP. That is shown through the actual GDP, the total value of all goods and services produced, right? So that is shown through your aggregate supply. Right? Now, if I choose a graph, if I make a graph where there is a line x is equals to y line, and think about this. If there is x is equals to y line, what it shows us that the values of x and y variables are same, right? So think about this. If this is y-axis, right? And this is x-axis, right? And if I make a simple curve, which is like this, if I make a simple curve, which is this, right? X is equals to y. Now, all points on this graph, all points on this graph, A, B, C, D, all, all points on this graph will show that the X and Y values are same, right? So on this graph, X and Y values are the same. Does it make sense? So whatever is the value of X, same is the value of, whatever is the value of X, same as the value of Y. Is it making sense, please? So what is the significance of X is equals to Y graph? That any point on this graph shows combination of X and Y values which are same. So X is equals to Y. That is what the significance is. Now to know why is this important in Kensing Cross? So this X is equals to Y curve is important in Kensing Cross because, got it, right? So if I take specific variables for you to better understand this, right? So let's say if I say income, let's assume, right? So this is your income and your, let's say income and what would be a good example? Income, or let's say forget about it. Let's take an even simpler example, right? So you have minutes of exercise. I think this should help. Minutes of exercise that someone is exercising. How many minutes is someone exercising, right? And on the y-axis, you have calories lost, right? So let's assume, I mean, we are making a hypothetical example. This might not always be true, right? If I assume that 1 minute of exercise helps you lose 1 calorie, 1 minute of exercise help you lose 1 calorie, right? Then this X is equals to Y graph will show you that if you're working out for 5 minutes, you will lose 5 calories. If you're working out 10 minutes, if someone is working out for 10 minutes, that person will, lose 10 calories. Similarly, if someone is working out 15 minutes, that person will lose 15 calories and so on. So it's X is equals to Y graph, right? It means that whatever the value of X variable is, same as the value for Y variable, right? That's what it shows. Okay. Now coming back to our main graph, Keynesian Cross. Now what it shows, X is equals to Y line over here is showing you all possible combinations of, it's showing you all possible combinations of equilibrium. Why is it showing you all possible combinations of equilibrium? Because unless your aggregate demand and aggregate supply are not equal, that can't be an equilibrium. Right? So in macroeconomics, we do know, right? In fact, we did talk about this even at the start of this topic, that aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which we know through our AS, right? So you used to have general price level on the y-axis, and you used to have GDP on the x-axis, and then you used to have downward sloping aggregate demand and aggregate supply, where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal. That's the equilibrium point, right? So upward sloping aggregate supply, downward sloping aggregate demand, where the two are equal, that's the equilibrium. That's the equilibrium point, right? That shows you how much will be the GDP of a country. That shows you what? The GDP of a country. Got it? Okay. Now, until and unless aggregate demand and aggregate supply aren't equal, that can't be an equilibrium. So this Y is equals to X line, this green line over here, shows you all possible combinations where the X and the Y variables values are the same. So which means that whatever is the value of aggregate supply, whatever is the total output produced in a country, which is the GDP, same is the aggregate expenditure, right? So if the total value of goods and services, for instance, let me also choose a point here and that will help you better understand, right? So if I choose 2 points on this X is equals to Y line, one is point A, one is point B, right? So point A shows you what? Point A shows you that if the total value of goods and services produced in a country were 15 million, right? $15 million, same was the aggregate expenditure. So total value of goods produced was also 15 million, and the total demand by consumers for different goods and services was also 15 million. So the economy was in equilibrium. Similarly, on point B, what it shows that if the total value of goods and services produced in an economy was, let's say, $30 million, right? So the total value of goods and services produced in the economy, because this is GDP, was 30 million. Then the total demand for all goods and services in the economy was also 30 million, right? So that is why I said that X is equals to Y line in this graph shows all possible combinations of equilibrium points. It shows all possible equilibrium points. Preet, is this helping or not? Is there still any confusion? I know it is a little tricky to understand, but if there's still any confusion, no worries, I can explain you again. Just a second. Okay, clear? Very nice, excellent, right? So X is equals to Y line. I'll write everything on the notes as well. Just give me a second, right? So X is equals to Y line is showing you all possible combinations of equilibrium points, all possible equilibrium points. Now think about this. If I choose, right? Now, if I choose, now we are coming to the very final stage. If I choose this GDP level, now you have to tell me, right? If I choose this GDP level, Preet, you have to tell me whether that would be an equilibrium or not, right? If I choose this GDP level, right? So let's say this is the GDP level, GDP 1, right? Is this an equilibrium, right? Is this an equilibrium? Let me take a specific value, right? Let's say this is $40 million, right? Now we know if this is $40 million, then this cuts the X is equals to Y line where it will be 40 million over here. Now you have to pay close attention, please. Now, if this is 40 million, right? This point I choose, right? So I connect it to the y-axis, that's also 40 million, and x-axis also gives you 40 million, because that is what the very definition of x is equals to y line is, right? That the two values, x and y variable values, will be the same. Now you can see for yourself that the aggregate expenditure at this GDP level is not 40 million. It's something less than 40 million. Right? Makes sense? So this, at this GDP level, right? Your aggregate expenditure is something less. Let's assume it's $35 million. So can this be the equilibrium point? Can this be the equilibrium point, right? The total demand for all goods and services in an economy at this point, let's label it as W, right? So at this point, W, the total demand for all goods and services in the economy is how much? $35 million. But how much is actually being produced? How do we know that this is the actual amount being produced? Because this is equals to your GDP. This is your aggregate supply. Now, when there is more production, right? Simply speaking, when there's more supply and there's less demand, what happens? When there's more supply, when there's more production and less demand, what happens? There will be some stock of goods that won't be sold. There is some stock surplus, absolutely excellent, right? There would be surplus and there would be some stock of output that won't be sold. Therefore, right, that would cause prices to reduce, and that would make producers realize that they have overproduced, so they will not they will cut on their production levels. They will cut on their production levels because they already have some unsold stock. So they will start producing less because they know that the demand is less and they have already produced more. So they will cut on their production. Now, similarly, let's choose another point. Let's choose another point. So if I choose another output level, right, which is to the left of this point. So to the left of this point, right? So if I choose another output level, right, which is, let's say, let me get rid of this because then it will be too much on the graph, right? Okay. Now, if I choose this GDP level, right? So let's say this is equals to GDP is equals to 20 million, right? So this is equals to $20 million, right? Now, where is this green line touching the y-axis? So it's touching the y-axis at this point. So it's touching the y-axis at this point, right? So that would also be 20 million. That would also be 20 million. But in this case, what's happening? The aggregate expenditure is higher. The aggregate expenditure in this case is higher than 20 million. That is, let's say, 25 million. Now, what is happening in this case, right? Right, I can. Right. So there's more demand for goods and services. The total demand for economies, goods and services at this level is $25 million, whereas the total output produced by the economy is only $20 million. So there is opposite. It's the opposite now. There's more aggregate demand and less aggregate supply. So that means that there is more demand for economies, for more demand for goods and services. So producers will realize that and will start producing more. So when they start producing more, obviously you move to the right. Then eventually we see that the economy will move to this GDP level. The economy will move to this GDP level where the X is equals to Y line and the aggregate expenditure line are intersecting. So that will be the equilibrium point in the economy, and that is your equilibrium level of GDP. That will be your equilibrium level of GDP. Does it make sense? Right? So long story short, the equilibrium GDP of a country would be where the X is equals to Y line, right? So on Keynesian Cross, on the Keynesian Cross, how do we identify the equilibrium GDP? So on Keynesian Cross diagram, we identify the Keynesian Cross, on the Keynesian Cross diagram, we identify the equilibrium GDP of a country by the point where the X is equals to Y line and the aggregate expenditure line are equal. So that is your equilibrium level of GDP, right? Exactly. Now, do you have to go somewhere, Preet, or we can continue? Yeah. Yeah, sure. I can definitely. In fact, that's a better idea. Okay, nothing about this, Preet. So let's quickly sum this up. And then we'll move on to the very final calculation that we need, and that would bring us to the end of this topic, right? Just give me a second. Okay, Preet, let's kind of sum this up, and then we will do some analysis based on this. Okay, now what is Kensing Cross? I said Kensing Cross is a graph like aggregate demand and aggregate supply model that predicts the GDP of a country. Now in Keynesian Cross, basically you draw two curves. You draw on the Keynesian Cross diagram, you draw two curves. What are they? Let me quickly tell you. So Keynesian Cross is a model that predicts the GDP of a country, right? And on the Keynesian Cross diagram, you draw two curves, right? One is of the aggregate expenditure. What is aggregate expenditure, right? I'll tell you. And on the y-axis, you have the aggregate expenditure. On the x-axis, you have the GDP, and we can also represent that with y. So in the brackets, I've written y. Okay, exactly. Now, one is aggregate expenditure line, and the second one is x is equals to y line. Very good, right? So what's the significance of the x is equals to y line? X is equals to y line shows you all possible equilibrium points. X is equals to y line is showing you all possible equilibrium points because it means that whatever is the value of the GDP, which is the total production, right? You can also, for the sake of your understanding, you can also think of it as aggregate supply, right? Is equals to the y values. And what do we have on the y-axis? So on the y-axis, we have aggregate expenditure, which is basically the aggregate demand in an economy, right? Okay. Now, until unless the aggregate demand and aggregate supply in an economy are equal, there will be a disequilibrium, right? So it can't be an equilibrium unless the aggregate demand and aggregate supply are equal, right? So all possible equilibrium points are only present on this x is equals to y line, right? Now, the second graph that we made, right? The second graph that we made on this diagram was the aggregate expenditure, right? Now, what is this aggregate expenditure graph shows? It shows that how much will be the total spending on goods and services, right? What will be the total demand for goods and services, right? based on different income levels. So it's upward sloping. We did talk about this. It will always be upward sloping because higher the incomes, higher the GDP in a country, higher the demand for goods and services, right? Now, where the aggregate demand, where the aggregate expenditure and X is equals to Y line intersect, that will be the equilibrium level of GDP of the country. Is this simple? So this is your, at this point in time, this much will be the equilibrium GDP level of a country. Now, this being said, now we are coming to some more advanced analysis. Okay. Now, Preet, quick question. What happens if any of the not components increase? We did say that aggregate expenditure, the y-intercept of aggregate expenditure is made up of these 5 components that I wrote, right? So that is made up of C naught plus I naught plus G naught plus X naught minus M naught, right? So these are the 5 components. Now my question to you is, Preet, what will happen to this aggregate expenditure curve if the consumption, autonomous consumption of the country increases? Increase in what ways? Will it become more steep? Will it shift parallel upwards? Will it shift parallel downwards? What do you mean when you say increase? What will happen to the aggregate expenditure curve when there is increase in autonomous consumption of the country, right? Rise in curve, exactly. So this entire curve will shift upwards parallel. So this entire curve will have a parallel upward shift, right? Have a look at this. Got it? Okay. Now, when the aggregate expenditure shifts upwards parallel, right, from AE to a blue curve to this brown, right? Now, where will be the new equilibrium level of GDP? So the new GDP level or the equilibrium level of GDP for the country would be where the 2 curves intersect, and that would be this point, Y2. Okay, now you have to listen to this carefully. For this much increase, right, in any of these components resulted in this much increase in, for this much increase in these components resulted in this much increase in GDP, right? So let me write this down, delta GDP, because this is the change in GDP and this much was the change in injection. Now, what is an injection? If you recall, Preet, from the circular flow of income diagram that we made at the start of this topic, I said injection, there are 3 injections in an economy, right? So the injections are basically the money flow, right? Additional money flowing into the country is known as injection. So these are the 3 injections in a country. So it could either be investment, or it could be government spending, or it could be exports. So due to these 3 injections, for this much increase in injections, there was this much increase in the GDP. Does it make sense? Preet? Now, what could you observe? By looking at this diagram, what could you observe? Right? What can you observe for this diagram? That for a smaller increase, right, a certain increase in injection, let's put it like this, for a certain increase or for a certain amount of injection in the economy, there was more than proportionate increase in the GDP. Yes or no? Because just by looking at it, you can tell that this was smaller, this change, this shift is not that much, but this changes more. This changes more, right? So what it shows us then, right? Exactly, right? So it's elastic. It will always be elastic, right? That's what I'm about to tell you. And that's bringing us to the concept called multiplier effect. Now, this is what we wanted to infer from this, right? Now, what is this multiplier effect? And this is oftentimes used in, different economics jargon and, economic reports and all that stuff. Now, what is multiplier effect? Let me go back to the notes and then tell you that what multiplier effect is, right? So multiplier effect says, right? Just a second. So multiplier effect says that certain increase in injection will result in more than proportionate change in, right? So multiplier effect says that a certain increase in injection will result in more than proportionate change in GDP, right? Now, what is injection? If we did not get the chance to write this term before, so injection is additional cash flow in an economy, which includes investment, right? Spending and exports, right? So that is what injection is. So injection is additional cash flow in an economy, which includes investment, government spending, and exports, right? So let's look at this one more time. So what is a multiplier effect? So multiplier effect says that a certain increase in injection, right? A certain increase in injection would result in more than proportionate change in GDP. Now, this is not all. We also need to know how to calculate it. So multiplier effect is calculated as, right? So multiplier effect is calculated as, basically there are two ways to calculate the multiplier effect. And both of these two are part of our syllabus, so we will obviously learn both of these. So one simple formula to calculate the multiplier effect is simply change in GDP divided by change in injection, right? So how much was the change in GDP, right? Divided by the change in injection, right? So that is one way to calculate the multiplier effect of an economy, right? The second way, exactly, excellent, right? Now, the second way to calculate the multiplier effect is through this formula. 1 divided by leakages. 1 divided by leakages. Now, what are leakages? We did talk about this. So leakages is any amount of money that is flowing out of the country. What is a leakage? Leakage is right. So any amount of money not flowing out of the country, but flowing out of the system. Flowing out of the system. Now, what do we mean by the system, right? So think about this. System means where, people are buying and selling, their transactions taking place in an economy, right? One person's money is being, it's circulating between different people. So when I go to a shop to buy something, I pay the cash, I pay the amount, right? That becomes the income of that shop owner. And then that shop owner spends that money on buying, let's say, the raw material or more products, then that becomes the income of some other person. And similarly, the cycle continues, right? Now, what is a leakage? Right? So leakage would be any money that is removed from the system. How so? Let's say if I save some of my money and I stop spending, right? Or let's say I would obviously, whatever amount I save, I would not be spending that money. So that is a leakage from the system, right? Similarly, if I spend some money on imports, that goes out of our country, right? That's also a leakage, right? And the third leakage is import, saving, and taxation, right? So when government takes some amount of income from the individuals, that's also leakage because that leaves the system, right? So these are the three leakages, right? So the idea is any amount of money flowing out of the system, which includes imports, when you spend money on buying other countries' products, saving, right? Any money that we have saved and we haven't, spent on goods. And the third one is taxation, right? So the money that we, right, got it, right? So just one last thing I want to show before we end the class, right? So the other formula would be 1 divided by leakages. And in this, we have 3 possible leakages. So one we are already familiar with, marginal propensity to save. The other one is marginal propensity to tax. And the third one is marginal propensity to import, right? Now, these might be the new words for you, right? Let me quickly just write this down and then we can continue our discussion tomorrow. So marginal propensity to tax is the change in taxation due to change in income, right? Now, if you see there is a clear-cut pattern for all these terms that we are discussing over here. So change in taxation, how much will be the rise in taxes due to rise in someone's income? That is your marginal propensity, right? In fact, this is known as marginal rate of taxation, MRT, right? So this is marginal rate of taxation, MRT, right? Then you have marginal propensity to import, and that would be the rise in imports due to, that would be change in imports due to change in income. So what this shows us basically is that how much will be the change in imports due to change in income. That is your marginal propensity to import, right? So when you add these three value ups, I mean, that should be enough. Right? That should be enough. Those notes and the ones that I'm making over here, in fact, those are also available to you. I've shared the drive with you. So those should be enough, right? So those should be enough. And then obviously we'll do a couple of, we'll do ample practice of past papers questions. So that should help. Yeah, that should be enough, right? So these are the two formulas. So one is this one divided by, and we'll see how to calculate these formulas tomorrow, right? And the other formula to calculate the multiplier effect is change in GDP divided by change in injection, right? Got it? Okay, so we should be completed. Today is 23rd, so we should be completed by first week of January. Or the 10th of January. 10th of January should be a fair estimate, right? Okay, so let's stop it for today and then we'll continue from tomorrow.